Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of the Civil Rights Movement. Our questions to think about here: what were the major events of the Civil Rights Movement in the early 1960s, and how did the African American Civil Rights Movement influence the women's movement of the 1960s? Beginning our story here in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, it's important to understand the role of President Kennedy in the story of the Civil Rights Movement. When John Kennedy was elected president in 1960, he won that election by a razor-thin margin, which meant he wasn't able to really step out and take risks in the early years of his presidency because he didn't necessarily have that support from even his own party. Keep in mind that we still have a strong contingent of conservative Democrats in the South. And if John Kennedy's going to accomplish anything during his presidency, he needs the support of these conservative Democrats. So he's unwilling to go out on a limb and support the civil rights movement. Now, personally, privately, Kennedy is supportive of the civil rights movement. He just can't take an official stance because he'll alienate those conservative Democrats. So in February of 1960, the situation is centered on a Woolworths store. We don't really have these anymore, but for those of you that remember, a Woolworth was what we call a five and dime store. And the closest thing I can relate it to is like a CVS or a Walgreens today. They sold a little bit of everything. And oftentimes the stores included a lunch counter where you could get a burger or a shake or, something small, sort of like a grill. And what was interesting about these Woolworth stores in the South is that the store itself wasn't segregated, but the lunch counter was. If you were African American, you could get takeout from the lunch counter, but you couldn't sit at the counter and eat your lunch. So on February 1st, 1960, 4 young men from a local university go into the Woolworth store and they make a couple of small purchases, and they're kind of highlighting, this odd situation where they can shop in this store, but they can't sit at the counter. So once they've made their purchases, they sit down at the lunch counter and very politely ask to be served. They're ignored. But they sit there for the next 45 minutes until the store closes, and then they get up and leave. The next day, they come in with many more people, and they occupy every seat at the lunch counter. They ask very politely to be served, and they're refused. Every day, the students came back to sit in the seats at the lunch counter, and the sit-in movement was born. This is a strategy, the sit-in, where protesters are occupying the seats at the lunch counter, which means that white people are not able to sit down at the lunch counter, which means if the lunch counter wants to make some money, they better serve the people sitting right in front of them. So the sit-in, it's almost like you're occupying the seat and forcing the business to either serve you or not make any money. And this is an incredibly effective tactic. It goes along with the nonviolent resistance strategy that Martin Luther King Jr. was promoting. Now, this just because the protesters were nonviolent doesn't mean that they didn't face violence, because they certainly did. Many of them were dragged out of the store, kicked and punched. They had food dumped on them. They were spat upon. But every day, as soon as one protester was dragged away, another would take their place. And this goes on until July, when the city officials in Greensboro finally lifted the whites-only policy for these types of businesses. And young people are really motivated by the sit-in movement. And so the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, This organization was created to keep the sit-in movement going, and it expands all throughout the South. And it even sort of branches out into read-ins at segregated libraries and wade-ins at segregated beaches and swimming pools. So this really builds momentum within the civil rights movement. Speaking of Martin Luther King Jr., Alabama Governor George Wallace had promised in his inaugural speech to uphold the racist standards and traditions of the white South. In his inaugural speech, Governor Wallace declared segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. Martin Luther King knew that having a peaceful demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama was a risky move. He knew that the police chief, Bull Connor, was going to use everything in his arsenal to shut down a peaceful protest. I mean, everything from having the fire department use water cannons against the protesters to disperse them, or to bring in police dogs to disperse the protesters. But Martin Luther King also understood that this would draw national attention to the movement. And so, sure enough, the protesters marched, the police called in the fire department and police dogs. And what's significant about this is that all of this was captured by reporters with television cameras. And so really, for honestly the first time, this brings the civil rights movement into the awareness of the white middle-class northern population. They had kind of been oblivious to what was going on in the South. And when the images of Birmingham came through their televisions, they were shocked. And it's going to have an impact in sort of getting this population motivated towards the civil rights movement. 1963 is often considered to be the high point of the civil rights movement because of the March on Washington. On August 28, 1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was the largest civil rights demonstration in American history. It's estimated that as many as 250,000 people gathered at the National Mall. So the photograph that you see here is Martin Luther King Jr. standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, looking out towards the Washington Monument and the U.S. Capitol building in the distance. And from that spot, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. If you go onto YouTube, you can see clips of this speech where he talks about having a dream of a world where people are not judged by the color of their skin and where America is a unified society. This is a huge moment in the civil rights movement. And in 1963, President Kennedy is going to begin to push for a new Civil Rights Act. But again, he's going to have to struggle against the support of the conservative Democrats from the South. And sadly, it's really Kennedy's assassination that's going to launch this into being. The new president, Lyndon Johnson, is going to really push for this Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlaws racial segregation in all public facilities. And it establishes the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that is meant to ensure equal opportunities for people applying for jobs, regardless of race or gender. Once the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed, the civil rights movement shifts its focus from desegregation to voting rights. Take a look at this chart on the left-hand side. This shows the percentage of eligible voters in southern states that were actually registered to vote. So in the orange, you see the African American population of these states. Take a look at Mississippi. Roughly, maybe 5 to 8% of eligible Black voters were actually registered to vote. And so the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is designed to change this. And it does two very important things. First, it requires federal examiners to help people register to vote, rather than having local or state officials do this. And then second, federal supervision of elections, again, rather than local officials. And then after the Civil Rights Act of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, take a look at the right-hand side of the chart and take a look again at Mississippi. We now have approximately 60% of eligible Black voters actually registered to vote. So we've made this huge difference. Now, Lyndon Johnson is going to face some backlash from both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on in our next topic. One of the most profound elements of the African American civil rights movement is how much it inspired other groups to push for their rights. Again, we are taking a very streamlined look at the civil rights movement, but the African American civil rights movement inspires American women to push for their rights, for Mexican and Mexican Americans to push for their rights, for Native Americans, for gays and lesbians, all to push for their rights. So keep that in mind, that this has an incredibly profound impact. I want to concentrate here for a moment on what we call the second wave of American feminism in the 1960s and 1970s. When we were talking about the affluent society of the late 1940s and 1950s, one of the things that we mentioned is that this was not an era that you saw the promotion of feminism. In fact, society was telling American women to go back into the kitchen and to do their duties as wives and as mothers. But Betty Friedan, this lady here, she is going to challenge the notion that women are content in being housewives. Many young women between the 1930s and 1940s had started to go to college, and they had studied world religion, philosophy, economics, and all of a sudden the most difficult part of their day was making sure their children got ready to go to school. I mean, this is not intellectually challenging. And Betty Friedan, in her famous book from 1963 called The Feminine Mystique, identified this as the problem with no name, that American women were just blatantly unsatisfied with their lives. And that women had sort of suffered with this as their own personal challenge, because society was telling American women the ultimate goal of your life is to become a wife and mother. And when a woman wasn't satisfied with that, she felt like something was wrong with her. And Betty Friedan comes out with this book, like I said, in 1963 called The Feminine Mystique, that basically said, you're not alone in this struggle. And it sort of awakens the American housewives to additional potential in their life. Betty Friedan was also instrumental in creating the National Organization for Women in 1966. This was a political organization created to help bring women's issues to the forefront of the conversation. So through the movement of NOW, women began to file lawsuits for equal wages. They demanded that companies provide daycare for their infants and preschool children. And women entered politics to lobby against laws that were unfair to women. The women's movement is going to expand. Like we said, this is the second wave of feminism. One of the major elements of the push here is for an Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, which would be a constitutional ban on discrimination based on sex. It got off to a strong start but it failed to be ratified by the required 38 states, and by 1982, it was dead. Another major issue coming out of the women's movement here is the issue of legal abortions. The Roe versus Wade case was heard by the Supreme Court in 1972, and when the Supreme Court made their decision, they're basing it on an earlier case of Griswold versus Connecticut from 1965. We'll talk more about the Griswold case later on, but this basically establishes a constitutional right to privacy. And when it came to the issue of abortion, the Supreme Court argued that the decision of whether or not to terminate a pregnancy during the first 3 months is a private conversation between a woman and her doctor. So this legalizes abortion during the first 3 months of pregnancy, although this is going to be a controversy that continues much beyond this moment. Despite the popularity of the women's movement in the 1960s and 1970s, it faces a serious criticism. First of all, many people, when they think about the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s, they have a tendency to focus on this small, very visible, radical group that essentially wants to restructure American society and overthrow the patriarchy. But really, one of the legitimate arguments of the women's movement is that it tended to focus on white middle-class women. It ignored women of color, and it ignored working class women. I mean, when you think about the differences in perspective, someone who works 60 hours in a diner might say, I would love to be able to stay home with my children, but I'm a single mother, or my family requires my income in order to survive. So the things that the suburban housewife was wanting was not necessarily the same as those of minority women or working class women. Within the journals, we'll take a look at the idea of a revolution within a revolution, and that connects with this moment in the women's movement. So coming back to our questions, think about what were the major events of the civil rights movement in the early 1960s. We have the sit-in movement beginning in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. We have the marches in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. We also have the March on Washington in 1963. And then the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were key milestones within this struggle. And then second, how did the African American civil rights movement influence the women's movement of the 1960s? It really does launch us into this second wave of American feminism that included people like Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem, but also key moments like the failure of the Equal Rights Amendment and then the Supreme Court decision in Roe versus Wade.